Now, insuring family members for financial benefits has come under the spotlight. A case currently in one of the courts in South Africa has brought this under the spotlight. A woman is accused of having arranged hits on family members. So, is a person who is found guilty having conducted multiple hits considered a serial killer? To discuss this, we are joined by criminal profiler Prof Gerard Labuschagne. Prof, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the agenda.
Thanks very much for having me.
Now, before we get to the bolts and the nuts of what drives a serial killer to be a serial killer, you say there's a difference between a serial killer and a serial murderer. What is it?
Yeah, that's kind of just more of academic difference. Murder, of course, is always an unlawful act. There's no legal justification for it. But people can kill multiple people and it's not against the law. So you might have, for example, a policeman in the line of duty who justifiably shoots someone in self-defense once or twice. That wouldn't make them a serial murderer. Technically, you could say it's a serial killer. So it's a bit of academic differentiation. In practicality, people often use the terms to refer to the same thing.
Okay. So what then constitutes a serial killer or a serial murderer? Does one have to personally and physically commit the offense, or do they have to hire hitmen to be considered serial murderers?
So essentially the definition that's kind of widely used, which comes from the FBI symposium from 2005, is essentially two separate murders committed by the same person. And then, of course, you'll get subtypes in terms of the motivation. So we'll have the good old-fashioned Moses Sithole type of serial murderer, which is what we typically see in South Africa, which is a guy who lures women into the veld and then rapes and murders them. And that's the majority of our murder series. But you don't have to do that specific modus operandi to be called a serial. So yes, someone who kills for money, like an insurance claim, or a taxi hitman, who kills two or more people in separate incidences, would still fall under that definition of a serial murderer. They just might be motivated by different reasons than, for example, your Moses Sithole. So in this instance, using a third party, which is the hitman, I would argue, yes, that you are, because your intention is to kill people. You're just using the third party, the hitman, as your instrument, whether it could have been yourself pulling the trigger, poisoning medication that the person might take, etc. So yes, in my opinion, this person, if found guilty, would be regarded as then being a serial murderer.
And I suppose that there's different levels and types of serial killers and murderers, and it's often said that most serial killers derive great satisfaction from the act of killing, and I suppose the gratification they receive from the act of murder differentiates them from one-time murderers, I suppose, who kill incidentally, put simply, to help commit or conceal another crime. And stated differently, serial killers, I suppose, have a chronic and overwhelming need to commit murder that sort of distinguishes them from those who kill one time because it serves other criminal interests. So what really drives them to do it?
So we don't ultimately know what makes one particular person become a serial compared to a family member or a friend, etc. But yes, most of them do have this urge to kill, and that's typically the ones that are actually committing the act physically themselves, like your Moses Sitholes. They have that urge to go out there, find a victim, lure them away, rape and murder them. I think the ones who are doing it more on the financial side of the spectrum, the benefit I don't think so much is about the murder aspect, because they're not hands-on in that process. But I think the overwhelming benefit for them is the financial rewards that they're going to get. And the more that they're successful with that, of course, that just encourages them to commit the next one and the next one and the next one. And if you obviously can kill people that are supposed to be the closest people to you, family, nieces, mother, boyfriends, etc., of course, you don't have that same kind of moral boundary that the rest of us have that would typically prevent us from doing something like that.
And I mean, it's been a trend, Prof, that so many of these serial killers and murderers, they actually admit to actually doing the offense or committing the offense. Yes, I did it. So what? Or they count a multiplicity of reasons. I'm actually reminded of a case of one serial killer in Swaziland who murdered 43 women, ostensibly because it was a revenge killing. He says that one woman wrongly accused him of raping him and he was incarcerated for that. So he developed a deep hatred for women and he decided to kill all 43 of them. So do they really have to admit that they did it before taking to the courts?
Well, I mean, Moses Atula did the same thing. He said his reason was because he had been falsely accused of a rape, which he had been imprisoned for prior to his murder series. And that's a common thing amongst those types of serial murderers. But we do, yes, as you point out, find it quite often that your serial murderers do confess relatively quickly without much sort of interviewing taking place. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to plead guilty later. In fact, almost all of them who do maybe do a formal confession to a magistrate or do what we call a pointing out to the police after their arrest, almost all of them will then plead not guilty in court and then claim that they were coerced to make that particular confession. So that is not an uncommon process, which is why one always has to make sure you finalize all your investigations as if you would be going to trial, even if the person is pleading, making a confession right in the beginning of their arrest. So they often change their mind in the intermediate time while they're awaiting trial in custody.
Professor, you've profiled some of the country's most notorious criminals and serial murderers. So when a serial murder has been taking place, say for instance, there is a number of people that have been killed at different places. So for you to come to the conclusion that a serial killer is on the loose, what is it that you take into consideration? I mean, do you analyze the bodies, whether it was mutilated or whether there's been some rituals being performed on the body for you to come to the conclusion that indeed a serial killer is on the loose?
Well, usually it's not, yes, you can get cases where you get very bizarre behavior, but the reality is most of these cases are kind of, it's a strangulation murder and a rape murder. So what we would typically look for is anything that could tell us that these two cases could be possibly the work of the same individual. So that could be anything from the geographic location where the two different bodies are found. We see serial murderers tend to group their crime scenes together. It could be a similarity in victimology. Of course, things like DNA nowadays are fantastic in terms of linking cases to each other. If you maybe, for example, both victims were raped, you could recover a DNA from the semen. And that, of course, is a very conclusive link between the two cases. So victimology, what was done to the victim, geographical location, and of course, forensic linkages are all the types of things we would use to kind of make ourselves aware that we have a potential serial and then obviously treat it as such from an investigation point of view.
Does the background or the family background of a serial killer count? I mean, we know that most of these serial killers, they come from dysfunctional family settings.
Well, many people in South Africa come from dysfunctional family settings. So we typically say that's probably not enough to cause them to become serial murderers, because then we would have a hell of a lot more than we have at this particular point in time. But there's probably some kind of predisposition for certain people. And where that predisposition comes from, we're not quite sure. And then probably what happens is that their environment that they're growing up in can then perhaps speed them down that road towards committing their first murder. Or perhaps if they grow up in a very stable environment, it might help slow down and maybe even prevent them actually eventually committing their first murder. But that kind of reasons to why does one person become and another person doesn't become a serial. For example, if it was purely environment, then two brothers that grew up in the same household should also then become serial murderers. So we're not quite yet having a final answer as to what creates and what causes a murder series. But I always say we do know what allows them to become a serial is poor police investigation. Because if you caught all your murderers and all your rapists after their first murder or rape, you wouldn't have a serial. The person wouldn't be able to develop into a serial.
All right, Professor, lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
That is a criminal profiler, Professor Gerard Labuschagne.